In the throbbing heart of a city buzzing with restless energy, a seismic event erupted that rewrote the fates of everyone it touched. It all ignited when a ragged, hard-luck family, faces carved with the raw scars of survival, shuffled into a grimy grocery store, clutching at the frail hope of a single, pitiful meal. Little did they suspect that their clash with the store's sour-tempered tyrant of an owner would summon an earth-shattering intervention from none other than Keanu Reeves. Yes, the Keanu, a living legend whose mere presence radiates pure, unadulterated awesomeness. What unfolded next was a heart-pounding, mind-melting miracle so outrageous it left onlookers gasping, redefined the very soul of compassion, and set the stage for a revolution that'll blow your freaking mind. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. The sun hung low over the city skyline, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. In a modest neighborhood, a small grocery store stood at the corner, its neon sign flickering intermittently. Inside, the air was filled with the mingling scents of fresh produce and baked goods. The aisles, though narrow, were neatly stocked, reflecting the meticulous nature of its owner, Mr. Harold Grimes. Mr. Grimes, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a perpetual scowl, prided himself on running a tight ship. His store was his kingdom, and he ruled it with an iron fist, often eyeing customers with suspicion, especially those who appeared less fortunate. On this particular evening, as the golden hues of dusk filtered through the storefront windows, the bell above the door chimed softly. A family of 4 stepped inside. A mother, her 2 young children, and an elderly woman who appeared to be the children's grandmother. Their clothes, though clean, were worn and patched, hinting at financial struggles. The mother, Maria, guided her children gently, her eyes scanning the shelves with a mix of hope and trepidation. Her son, Alex, a boy of about 10, clutched a small list written in careful handwriting. His younger sister, Lily, held onto her grandmother's hand, her wide eyes taking in the array of colorful products. As they moved through the store, selecting basic necessities, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a few cans of soup, Mr. Grimes watched them closely from behind the counter. His eyes narrowed as he observed Maria counting coins from a small purse, her brow furrowed in concentration. When the family approached the register, placing their modest selection on the counter, Mr. Grimes couldn't contain his disdain. "Is this all?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Maria nodded, offering a polite smile. "Yes, sir, just these, please." Mr. Grimes eyed the items, then glanced at the coins Maria held out. "This isn't a charity. If you can't pay, you can't stay." Maria's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I believe I have enough." Before she could finish, Mr. Grimes waved a dismissive hand. "Out now." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as she gathered her children, turning to leave. The other customers pretended not to notice, their eyes averted. Just as the family reached the door, a calm voice broke the tense silence. "Excuse me, but that's no way to treat customers." All eyes turned to the source of the voice. A man stepped forward from the back of the store, his demeanor unassuming yet commanding. Dressed in a simple black jacket and jeans, his dark hair slightly tousled, he exuded an air of quiet confidence. Mr. Grimes frowned. "And who might you be?" The man offered a gentle smile. "Just someone who believes in treating people with respect." A murmur rippled through the store as recognition dawned on several faces. Whispers of "is that?" and "it can't be" filled the air. Ignoring the growing buzz, the man approached the counter, standing beside Maria and her family. "How much for their groceries?" Mr. Grimes sneered. "More than they can afford." The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek wallet. "Then I'll cover it." He handed Mr. Grimes a crisp $100 bill. "Keep the change." The store owner stared at the money, then back at the man, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation. "Why?" The man met his gaze steadily. Because kindness is free, but it can mean everything to someone in need. Turning to Maria, he added, "Please take what you need." Maria's eyes shimmered with gratitude. Thank you so much." As the family gathered their items, the man gave a small nod and turned to leave. It was then that a young woman near the produce section spoke up, her voice filled with awe. "Wait, you're Keanu Reeves, aren't you?" The man paused, a modest smile tugging at his lips. "I am." A collective gasp swept through the store. Phones appeared as customers snapped photos, capturing the unexpected encounter. Keanu Reeves stepped outside the store, the chill of the evening air wrapping around him like an old, familiar presence. The city buzzed with life, cars passing, pedestrians moving with the quiet urgency of people who had places to be. But amidst all of it, the moment he had just witnessed still clung to the air like an echo. Maria and her children stood at the curb, their grocery bags held close, their shoulders still carrying the invisible weight of struggle. They had food now, for tonight, maybe for a few days. But what about after that? The problem was never just one meal. It was the cycle, the crushing force of circumstances that kept people like Maria on the edge of survival. Keanu had seen it before. He had lived it in a way. There had been nights in his own past when all he had was hope, nights when he questioned whether the road ahead would ever be different. And now, here he was, standing at the intersection of his past and someone else's desperate present. He looked down at his hands. Money could buy food, but it couldn't erase exhaustion from a mother's eyes. It couldn't mend the quiet ache in a child's stomach that had become too familiar to complain about. The city swallowed moments like this, but he couldn't let this one disappear. He turned back toward the store, glancing through the glass at the people still murmuring inside. The store owner, Mr. Grimes, stood behind the counter, rubbing his forehead, clearly unsettled by what had just transpired. Change had a way of creeping in, whether people welcomed it or not. Keanu exhaled and started walking, past the store, past the watching eyes, past the street corners lit in the neon glow of cheap diners and taxi signs. He didn't have a plan, just a direction. 3 blocks away, the neighborhood changed. The clean, carefully maintained storefronts gave way to buildings with cracked facades and windows covered with iron bars. The sidewalks were rougher here, the street lights flickering with hesitation. Keanu stopped in front of a small community center, its blue-painted doors slightly chipped, a sign above it that read, "Hope Outreach." He had passed by this place before but had never stepped inside. Tonight, something told him it was time. Pushing open the doors, he was met with the low hum of quiet conversation. The space inside was simple: folding chairs, a few tables, a counter with a coffee pot that had likely been refilled too many times. People sat huddled in small groups, some eating, others lost in their thoughts. A woman in her late 50s, wearing a warm but worn-out sweater, noticed him immediately. Her name tag read Maggie, and her tired eyes carried the kind of understanding that only came from years of witnessing both suffering and resilience. "You lost or looking to help?" she asked, wiping her hands on a rag. Keanu smiled slightly. Helping seems like the right option. She studied him, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "You look familiar." "People say that." He let the moment settle before adding, "What do you need the most here?" Maggie gestured around. "Depends on the night. Food, coats, someone willing to listen. Mostly, people just need to be seen. They need to know they exist outside of their struggle." Keanu nodded, glancing at the people scattered around. Some of them were here for a meal, some for warmth, and others because they simply had nowhere else to be. "I met a family tonight," he said after a moment. "A mother and 2 kids. They have food for now, but that's not enough." Maggie sighed. "It never is." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a few bills, placing them on the counter. "I want to do more. I just don't know how yet." Maggie didn't reach for the money. Instead, she studied him again, as if measuring the weight of his sincerity. Then she nodded toward the back. "We have a kitchen," she said. "Are you any good at making sandwiches?" Keanu chuckled, the unexpectedness of the request catching him off guard. "I think I can manage." "Good, we've got more hungry mouths to feed than we have hands." She turned and led the way, and without hesitation he followed. For the next 2 hours, Keanu found himself behind a counter, stacking bread, spreading peanut butter, and handing out plates to people whose gratitude was quiet but undeniable. He listened to stories, some brief, some long, all of them carrying the undercurrent of a world that had been unkind to them. And yet, despite everything, there was laughter here. There were moments of light tucked between the hardships. By the time the evening wound down, Keanu sat at a small table, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. Maggie sat across from him, arms crossed. "You're not just passing through, are you?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore." Maggie smirked. "Well, don't think you can just waltz in here, make a few sandwiches, and call it a day. If you're serious about helping, we'll put you to work." Keanu grinned. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Maggie's smirk softened into something more genuine. "Good, because something tells me you're just getting started." Outside, the city continued its restless motion, unaware that something quiet but powerful had just begun. The city stretched ahead like a living, breathing thing, its heartbeat pulsing through flickering streetlights and the hum of distant traffic. Keanu walked with purpose, though he wasn't quite sure where his steps would lead. The encounter at the store was still fresh in his mind, the weight of injustice, the fleeting triumph of kindness, but it wasn't enough. Helping one family was a moment, a single ripple in an ocean that needed waves. He knew that if he truly wanted to make a difference, it had to be bigger, more than a simple act of generosity, something lasting. Ahead, a row of old buildings lined the street, some abandoned, others just barely holding on. The kind of places people overlook, forgotten, like the people who drifted past their doors. One building stood out, a former bakery, its windows dark, its sign weathered but still readable. The name had faded with time, but the place still held something, a lingering presence of what it once was. Keanu stopped in front of it, hands in his pockets. An idea had been forming in the back of his mind since he left the shelter, but standing here, it took shape in a way he couldn't ignore. A space like this, it could be something more. A place where families like Maria's didn't have to feel like burdens, where no one had to beg for basic decency, where food wasn't a privilege but a right. His fingers hovered over his phone. He had resources, connections, the ability to turn ideas into reality. He had spent his life stepping into different worlds, on screen, in stories, but this was real. This mattered. He made a call. "Hey," he said when the voice on the other end answered. "I need some help with something." Days passed in a blur of movement. Calls, meetings, paperwork, the quiet bureaucracy of change. It would have been easy to throw money at the problem, to fund an existing charity and move on. But that wasn't enough. He wanted to be in it, to build something from the ground up. The bakery was secured in record time. It wasn't much yet, peeling paint, a roof that needed work, but the foundation was solid. It had history that mattered. Word spread faster than he expected. It started as whispers. Keanu Reeves bought the old bakery. Speculation ran wild. Some thought he was opening a restaurant, others assumed it was some Hollywood venture. But the truth was simpler. One morning, he stood in the middle of the empty space, dust swirling in the shafts of light that slipped through the boarded-up windows. A group of volunteers stood with him, some from the shelter, others drawn in by the growing buzz. People from the neighborhood, people who wanted to help. A woman in her 60s, her hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, looked around skeptically. "So, what exactly is this place gonna be?" Keanu exhaled, placing his hands on his hips as he took in the bare walls, the possibilities. A place where no one gets turned away. No other explanation was needed. The first few weeks were chaotic. Supplies arrived in waves, deliveries of everything from industrial ovens to second-hand furniture. What he couldn't buy new, the community donated. Some gave money, others gave time. A group of retired carpenters offered to rebuild the counters. A local artist painted a mural on the side of the building, hands reaching out, lifting each other up. There were challenges, permits, zoning laws, logistics that threatened to slow everything down, but Keanu was patient, persistent. He had spent his life navigating impossible odds. This was no different. And the neighborhood, once skeptical, began to believe. People stopped him on the street. A man in a construction uniform patted him on the shoulder, saying, "You don't see guys like you doing stuff like this." A woman in a worn coat left a pie on the doorstep with a note, "For when you need a break." And Maria, she returned, not just as a recipient but as a part of it. She helped where she could, watching as something bigger than any one person began to take shape. What had started as an idea was becoming real, a place where kindness wasn't an event, but a way of life. And Keanu knew this was only the beginning. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. The once abandoned bakery, stripped of its former decay, was breathing again. Where dust had settled, movement now stirred. Where silence had reigned, the sounds of work and collaboration filled the air. Morning started early. Volunteers arrived before dawn, each carrying something: bags of flour, fresh produce, tools, or simply their presence, ready to help in whatever way they could. There was no grand opening, no ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just effort poured into every inch of the place, as if it had been waiting for this second life all along. Keanu worked among them. He didn't hover or supervise. He lifted, carried, cleaned, painted. His hands were as stained with flour and sawdust as anyone else's. The first time someone pointed out that he didn't need to be here, that he could just fund it and step back, he had simply shaken his head and kept working. Word continued to spread. It wasn't just about the bakery anymore. It was about what it represented, something rare in a city that moved too fast for second chances. A place where people could walk in without fear of being turned away. A place where food was never a question of affordability. A place that belonged to everyone, not just those who could pay. It wasn't perfect. There were days when things went wrong. Orders didn't arrive on time. Equipment broke. The city's bureaucracy dragged its feet on approvals, but momentum had taken hold and the force of community was stronger than any single setback. The first meal served wasn't anything elaborate, just a simple, warm loaf of bread, fresh from the oven. It was handed to an elderly man who had spent most of his nights on a nearby bench. He took it, held it for a long moment as if unsure whether he should believe in what was being offered, then nodded in silent thanks before walking away. That was how it began. Soon others came, some hesitantly, uncertain if there was some catch, some hidden requirement they had to meet. Others with quiet desperation, their hunger outweighing their pride. No one was turned away. People started calling it the open table. No one knew exactly who had given it the name, but it stuck. It was fitting. What made it special wasn't just the food, it was the absence of barriers. There was no counter dividing those who served from those who needed it. No paperwork, no proof of hardship required. The only thing expected of anyone who walked in was to eat, to take what they needed, and, if they could, to give back in whatever way they chose. Some started by sweeping floors, others washed dishes. A few, who had once come in with empty hands, returned with ingredients they had somehow managed to gather. Slowly, people weren't just receiving help, they were becoming part of something. Keanu watched it happen. He saw how, over time, strangers became familiar faces. How Maria, once a struggling mother who had walked into a grocery store with nothing but hope and a handful of coins, now moved with quiet confidence, helping new visitors feel welcome. There were no grand speeches. No news cameras captured the moment, but it was happening change in its quiet, relentless way. One evening, as the last of the bread was pulled from the ovens and the scent of warmth filled the air, Keanu stood outside, looking at the sign above the door. The open table. It was more than a name, it was a promise. And for the first time in a long while, he knew this was exactly where he was meant to be. The open table became something more than a place to get a meal. It was a heartbeat in the community, a steady rhythm that people could rely on. Each day, the doors opened, and a mix of people filtered in, some hungry, some lonely, some just needing a break from the weight of their lives. It started simply. Someone would walk in, hesitating at the door as if expecting rejection. But there were no barriers here, no hoops to jump through. A warm meal was placed in front of them, no questions asked. And in return, they offered what they could: time, effort, a story shared over a cup of coffee. The place had its regulars now. There was Henry, an old man who rarely spoke, but always showed up at sunrise to mop the floor before the first batch of bread came out. There was Cassie, a single mother with 2 jobs who often arrived just before closing, taking home leftovers so her son could have a full meal the next day. And then there were the ones who came through in crisis. One evening, as the last of the dinner rush wound down, a young man stumbled in. His clothes were torn, his hands shaking. He had the look of someone who had been fighting battles no one could see. He barely made it to the counter before his legs buckled beneath him. No one asked what had happened. They didn't need to. A bowl of soup was set in front of him. A chair was pulled out. A quiet space was made. That was the way of the open table. It didn't pry, didn't demand explanations. It just was. Keanu saw it all unfold as he worked in the back, kneading dough, listening to the hum of voices outside the kitchen. The place had taken on a life of its own, moving beyond the idea that had first sparked it. One night he stepped outside, watching the city breathe around him. The lights flickered in apartment windows, the distant murmur of life carried through the streets. The open table had become a refuge, a reminder that even in a world that often felt cold, there were still pockets of warmth. He had spent years searching for something like this without realizing it. Not fame, not fortune, just purpose. Inside, laughter rang out, a rare, unexpected sound in a place that had once known only silence. It was enough, for now it was enough. The open table had started as a single idea, but like roots breaking through the pavement, it spread. The neighborhood responded in ways Keanu hadn't expected. At first it was small. Someone left a stack of donated blankets by the door, neatly folded with a note, "For anyone who needs warmth." The next week, a retired chef wandered in, sleeves rolled up, ready to cook, asking for nothing in return. Then came the musicians, buskers, and hobbyists, who played softly in the corner, their melodies filling the air with something unspoken, something healing. One afternoon, an elderly woman arrived with a notebook tucked under her arm. She didn't come for food. She came to write. Sitting by the window, she filled page after page, eyes distant yet focused. Someone finally asked her what she was working on. "I'm writing down their stories," she said simply, nodding toward the people around her. "Someone should remember." And so, without planning for it, the open table became more than a place to eat. It became a place to be seen. Keanu watched it unfold like a quiet revolution. He still worked in the kitchen, still baked bread alongside volunteers, but something had shifted. He wasn't running the open table anymore. It belonged to the people now. He had simply given it the spark. You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going. One evening, after the last of the dishes had been washed and the doors had closed, Keanu lingered. He stood in the dim light, the scent of flour and spices still hanging in the air. The place had a heartbeat now, a rhythm that continued even when empty. He stepped outside, the city cool and quiet. Across the street, a man sat on the curb, gazing at the building. His clothes were worn, his hands calloused. There was something unreadable in his expression, not quite sadness, not quite hope. Keanu didn't approach, didn't interrupt whatever thoughts held him there. Instead, he sat down a few feet away, letting the silence settle between them. After a while, the man exhaled, slow and heavy. "Places like that," he murmured almost to himself. "They don't usually last." Keanu glanced at the open table, the faint glow of the sign reflecting in the windows. "This one will." The man didn't argue. He just nodded as if trying to believe it. Keanu sat with him a while longer, saying nothing, because sometimes just showing up was enough. The days turned into months, and the open table no longer felt like a project. It felt like it had always been there, as if the city had carved out a space for it long before Keanu had ever stepped inside. It moved with its own momentum now, powered by the hands that kept it running, the feet that walked through its doors, the stories that left with those who needed them most. The seasons changed. The air grew sharper, the nights colder. With the drop in temperature came new faces, those who had braved the streets too long, searching for warmth. Keanu spent more time in the background now, letting others take the lead. The open table had never been about him, and he made sure it never would be. He worked where he was needed, kneading dough in the early mornings, fixing a broken chair in the afternoon, hauling bags of donated coats in the evening. He liked it that way. One night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the streets, rattling the old window panes. The doors remained open as they always did, and inside, people huddled together over bowls of hot soup. The scent of fresh bread mixed with the dampness of rain-soaked clothes, the warmth of the kitchen battling the cold that seeped in through the cracks. Some of them would stay until the storm passed. Some had nowhere else to go. Keanu noticed an older man sitting alone near the door, his back hunched, his hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee. He hadn't touched his food. Keanu didn't ask him why. He had learned by now that people spoke when they were ready. Instead, he brought over another blanket, draping it over the man's shoulders. For a long moment, there was only silence between them, the storm outside filling the empty spaces. Then, finally, the man took a slow sip of his coffee, as if remembering something long forgotten. The doors rattled in the wind. A candle flickered on the table. Somewhere in the back, a quiet voice hummed an old song. Keanu exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest. This wasn't just a place anymore. It was a shelter against the world, a refuge in the middle of the storm. And no one, no matter who they were, no matter what they had lost, would ever be turned away. The winter deepened, pressing its weight against the city. The open table didn't just endure, it adapted. More blankets arrived, extra space was made, new volunteers stepped in without needing to be asked. Keanu found himself drawn to the quiet, unnoticed moments. The way hands reached for warmth before food, the way a simple gesture, a dry coat, a place to sit, meant more than any grand gesture ever could. One night, as the wind howled through the alleyways, a group of teenagers arrived. They were hesitant, not fitting the usual picture of those who sought shelter. Their clothes weren't ragged, but their faces were drawn, eyes darting with a mix of defiance and something else. Uncertainty, maybe. No one questioned them. A table was cleared, plates were set down. They ate fast, as if afraid the food might be taken away. Keanu watched from the back, not wanting to intrude. He had seen this before, people on the edge of slipping through the cracks, balancing between choices they weren't ready to make. One of them, a girl with dark curls tucked under a hood, glanced around as if trying to decipher the place. Her hand remained near her pocket, instinctively guarded. Slowly, the tension in their shoulders loosened. The laughter of others in the room softened the hard edges they had carried in with them. One of the boys muttered something to another, and for the first time, there was the trace of a grin. By the time they left, they hadn't said much, but Keanu knew they would be back. Later that night, after the last plate was washed and the floors were swept, he stood by the window, watching the street. A thought lingered. The open table had grown into something steady, but there were still too many people out there, people who wouldn't make it to the door in time, people who had stopped believing places like this existed. It wasn't enough to wait for them to come. Keanu turned away from the glass, the weight of a new idea settling in his bones. If they wouldn't come to the open table, then the open table would have to find them. The next morning, before the city had fully woken, Keanu stood in the empty kitchen of the open table. The scent of yesterday's baking still clung to the walls, but the silence was different now. Something had shifted overnight, the weight of an unspoken realization settling in. Waiting wasn't enough. The open table had become a beacon, a shelter, a promise. But promises meant nothing to those who never made it through the door, people who had already decided that help wasn't meant for them. The ones too far gone, too used to being ignored. That was who he was thinking about now. He had spent enough time listening, watching. He knew where they were, the corners of the city where the lights didn't reach, the spaces people hurried past without looking. Under bridges, behind old factories, tucked into the shadows of forgotten streets. It wasn't just about hunger. It was about existence. Some people had gone so long without kindness that they no longer knew how to accept it. That's where he needed to go. By sunrise, the plan was already moving. The kitchen was alive with early morning activity, volunteers prepping for another long day. But today, some of that food wouldn't stay here. Today, it was going out into the world. Keanu wasn't alone in this. He had built something that wasn't just his anymore. The open table had drawn in people who understood, people who had once been on the other side of that door, who knew what it meant to be unseen. Boxes were packed, fresh bread, hot soup sealed in sturdy containers, extra blankets folded neatly between layers of food. Everything stacked into the back of an old van that had been donated just weeks ago, its rusted edges a reminder of past lives, now repurposed for something better. By mid-morning, they were on the road. The city was different when you weren't moving through it as a visitor. It revealed itself in pieces, in the small, quiet spaces where people disappeared. Keanu knew where to look. The first stop was an alleyway behind an old laundromat. A man sat hunched between a pile of flattened cardboard, his coat wrapped tightly around him. He didn't look up when the van pulled in. No words were needed. A meal was placed beside him, a thermos of hot tea. Keanu didn't linger, didn't press, just left it there, making sure it wouldn't be mistaken for trash. The next stop was harder. An encampment near the train station, hidden from sight but not from the cold. A cluster of makeshift tents, tarps sagging under the weight of last night's frost. Some people watched warily as they approached, others barely stirred. The volunteers moved carefully, placing food where it was needed, handing out blankets to those who reached for them. Keanu crouched beside an older woman who was bundled in layers of mismatched clothing. She didn't speak, just clutched the steaming cup of soup in her hands as if it were the only warmth left in the world. Further down, a younger man sat alone, legs drawn to his chest. He didn't take the food right away, just stared at it as if trying to decide whether to believe in it. Keanu understood that look. No rush, no pressure. The van kept moving, through quiet streets, past boarded-up buildings, into spaces where desperation had settled so deeply that hope felt like a foreign thing. Some people took the food with shaking hands. Others didn't take it at all, too used to saying no, even when the offer was real. That was okay. This wasn't about fixing everything in a day. It was about showing up. Keanu had learned that change wasn't about grand gestures. It was about persistence. So they would be back, tomorrow, the next day, as long as it took. The city didn't change overnight. But as the van made its way back toward the open table, the weight on Keanu's shoulders felt different. Not lighter, but purposeful. This wasn't just about a meal. This was about reminding people they were still here. that they still mattered, and that no matter how far they had fallen, they weren't forgotten. The van pulled up to the open table just as the sky started to turn gold, the city stretching into another evening. The weight of the day lingered, heavy but not unwelcome. They had covered miles, handed out meals, looked into the faces of those the world had long stopped looking at. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Keanu stepped out, stretching his arms, feeling the ache settle into his muscles. The others followed, quiet but steady, their faces marked by exhaustion and something else, determination. Inside, the kitchen was still warm, the scent of bread laced with the last traces of coffee from the afternoon rush. The volunteers who had stayed behind were cleaning up, wiping down counters, stacking chairs. The open table never truly closed, but this was the slow moment, the space between what had happened today and what would happen tomorrow. Keanu moved without thought, his hands finding a dish towel, his body settling into the rhythm of the place. Cleaning, organizing, preparing for what came next. There was no ceremony to it, no announcement. Just work, honest, steady, and necessary. As he rinsed plates, he thought about the man in the alleyway, the older woman clutching her soup, the younger one who couldn't bring himself to accept help. They were all still out there, right now, braving another night. That knowledge used to weigh heavier. Now it fueled him. A few volunteers sat at one of the side tables, their voices low, their hands wrapped around cups of tea, exhaustion etched into their postures. These were the people who kept this place alive, who had stepped up without being asked. Some of them had been on the other side of this once. Some still were. Keanu wasn't one for speeches, so he didn't make one. Instead, he did what he always did. He worked beside them, side by side, without pretense or distance. The open table was never about him. That had been clear from the start. It was about them, every person who walked through the doors, every hand that helped lift the weight of the world, even for just a moment. Outside, the city pressed on, unaware of the quiet revolution happening here. Keanu had spent his life in different roles, stepping into stories that weren't his own. But this wasn't a role. This wasn't fiction. This was real, and it mattered in a way he had never quite experienced before. It wasn't about saving people. No one needed a hero. They just needed to be seen. And as long as there were hands willing to reach out, the open table would always be here. The city never stopped moving, but tonight something felt different. The air was still, the lights seemed softer, and in a quiet corner of it all, the open table stood as a beacon, not just of warmth, but of something far greater. A revolution wrapped in something as simple as bread, as ordinary as an open door. Keanu Reeves, a name the world knew, a face the world recognized, stood inside, sleeves rolled up, hands dusted with flour, surrounded by the people who had made this place what it was. He wasn't an actor here. He wasn't a star. He was a worker, a giver, a man who had seen too much of life to turn away from those struggling in its shadows. There had always been whispers about Keanu, stories of his kindness, his humility, his unwavering commitment to people. He never sought attention for the good he did. He never wanted cameras flashing in his face, broadcasting his generosity. He simply did what was right, not for applause, but because he believed in it with every fiber of his being. The open table had become a reflection of that belief. It wasn't a charity, wasn't a publicity stunt, wasn't just another project in a long list of good deeds. It was something real, something that would outlast him, outlast any single moment. It had started with a single act of kindness in a grocery store, but like wildfire, it had spread, reaching those who needed it most. Tonight, Keanu wasn't just another worker in the kitchen. He was everywhere. His presence, his influence, his relentless compassion were woven into every corner of this place. Every bowl of soup handed out, every loaf of bread shared, every warm blanket draped over shivering shoulders, it all traced back to him, to the simple idea that no one should be left behind. People often said that Keanu Reeves was different. that he wasn't like other celebrities, that there was something almost otherworldly about his kindness. But the truth was simpler: he cared. And because he cared, lives were changing. As the last of the night's guests finished their meals, as the tables were cleared and the chairs stacked, Keanu stepped outside. The air was cold, the stars sharp against the dark sky. He looked at the street stretching ahead, at the world that still had so much pain, so much need. It would never be enough. Not one man, not one place. The world was too big, the struggles too vast. But that had never stopped him before. Keanu Reeves had built something here. He had poured himself into it, not as a savior, but as a believer. He knew that one act of kindness was never just one act. It rippled, spread, took root in places he'd never see. The open table would stand long after he walked away, long after his name faded from its walls, because it was never about him. It was about humanity. Keanu took a breath, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. He had lived many lives, on screen, in stories, in the endless echo of his own past. But this was the greatest story he had ever been a part of. And it wasn't over yet. With a quiet smile, he turned back toward the doors, back into the warmth, back into the place where he belonged. Because Keanu Reeves was never just a star. He was a light, and he would never stop shining. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel. That way you'll never miss our newest uploads.